Hello and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership. I'm Ben Simmons and serve as the head of the GGKP Secretariat. This is the second in our series on sustainability after COVID-19, and we're absolutely delighted you are joining us today and hope that you and your families are all healthy and safe. Today's webinar, we're quite fortunate to have a very distinguished panel of global experts who will look at the potential impact that COVID-19 response could have on public policies, and in particular, some of the key other government priorities, such as poverty reduction, promoting equality, and promoting sustainability. During the webinar, of course, please feel free to make comments through the questions box. It's a great opportunity to engage directly with our experts, and we'll do our best to ensure that they receive those. And of course, after the webinar today, please take a few minutes to complete our short survey. These short surveys, they really do help us in ensuring that future webinars learn from our previous ones. A full recording of today's webinar will also be available on our platform, and that's at ggkp.org, and we'll be circulating that shortly after the webinar. I should mention that the next webinar in this series will take place in approximately 2 weeks, and for that webinar, we're going to be jointly working with the German Development Institute. The webinar will also invite a panel of experts to explore an interesting question about the Green New Deal movement that we see taking place both in the EU and other countries, and to explore to what extent can that New Deal movement survive and potentially thrive after the pandemic. Finally, if you're not familiar with the GGKP, I would encourage you to visit our web platforms and join the growing community. You can do that at ggkp.org/subscribe. This is the best way to stay up to date on the latest studies, the latest insights, and other information related to COVID-19 and green growth. It is now my, of course, great pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's event, a very close friend of the GGKP, Najma Mohamed. Najma is the policy director at the Green Economy Coalition, which is an organization that's really spearheading the global movement for an inclusive green economy transition. If you're not familiar with the GEC, I would encourage you to take a look at their website. It's a fantastic group, and they're doing some really interesting work. Before joining the GEC, Najma had a very interesting career. She was started initially with the International Labor Organization, working with their Green Jobs team. Was also a member of the UN Partnership for Action on Green Economy team. She spent some time working in South Africa as part of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, and is also the author of a book, Sustainability Transitions in South Africa. Najma, I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to today's webinar and very happy to turn the virtual podium over to you. Najma, the webinar is yours.
Thank you, Ben, for the introduction and for giving the GEC the opportunity to be part of this incredible conversation. Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second webinar of the series, Sustainability After COVID-19. We will focus on the topic Public Policies for Inclusive Green Growth. So I'm part of the policy team of the Green Economy Coalition, a global alliance of more than 50 organizations committed with our global partners, our national partners, to accelerate a just transition to green and fair economies. About 6 weeks ago, almost to the day, I was on my last 40 minutes train ride back home, just a few days before the official lockdown here in the UK. I think I was trying to ready myself mentally for what work and life would be like in the coming weeks, and the uncertainty of not knowing how long this lockdown would last. I'd also had quite a few conversations in the weeks before with former colleagues and friends in North Italy, where I had lived and worked, and I had a sense of what we were going to be having to cope with as a community here in the UK. So my mind was focused here trying to get myself all ready and get my family ready for this new situation. But my heart was probably in my home country. As Ben mentioned, I worked in South Africa, and I'm from South Africa. And South Africa currently is experiencing the second recession in 2 years. We've had, persistent unemployment for decades, and a fragile public health system. And I knew that this crisis that we were going through as a global community, there were particularly vulnerable groups the hungry, homeless, the countless unemployed. And I knew also that the situation that people were going to face in my home country was a situation not unknown to that many countries in the global south would face. The COVID-19 pandemic has really brought us all, I think, to a pause. And as governments have rightly focused on prioritizing health and emergency response measures in these difficult weeks that we've been through, provided, short-term economic and social support to the vulnerable, we found ourselves now at the moment where we're beginning to start thinking about what our recovery would be like. We know that it's a recovery unprecedented, an economic recovery that's unprecedented. It's been likened to be probably bigger than what we've experienced in the 2008 financial crisis and even the Great Depression of the 1930s. And we really need to put forward transformative solutions that include people, that build our resilience to health crises and that also address the ongoing inequality climate and biodiversity crisis that we're facing. We've also seen that this crisis has exposed the existing fault lines in our economies that ignore the burden of unpaid care work that's in fact largely borne by women. They don't provide adequate support to small businesses that form the bedrock of the economies in many countries, and that are blind to our dependence on nature and climate systems. So we've heard in the recent weeks, and I guess for many of you working in the policy community, it hasn't quite felt like lockdown. In fact, it's felt like some of the busiest periods in probably our careers that many of us have experienced. Calls for green and just recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic are growing. They've never been more timely. We're going to see an economic stimulus package, the likelihood of which, as one of the speakers in the webinar 2 weeks back said, we're probably not going to be seeing in our lifetimes, footed by the public purse. And we really need to make sure that these stimulus packages invest in an economy that, yes, reinvigorates our economies, creates jobs, but also puts people's well-being at the center and delivers the climate and biodiversity action that we need. So joining me in this conversation today to explore public policies for inclusive green growth, I'd like to welcome the panelists. Thank you all for coming. I'll give an introduction and also an apology from one of our panelists that has just, due to connectivity problems, not been able to join us. But it gives me great pleasure in welcoming Anthony Cox, the Deputy Director of the Environment Directorate at the OECD. Mohan Munasinghe, founder and chairman of the Munasinghe Institute for Development. Kevin Urama, the senior director of the African Development Institute, the capacity development arm of the African Development Bank. Thank you all for joining, and I hope you're all keeping well. We were also looking forward to having Ligia Noronha, the director of UN Environment Economy Division, with us today, and we were very sorry to lose Ligia just at the last minute due to challenges in connectivity. But thank you all for joining us, Anthony, Kevin, Mohan. I'm sure, like me, you're going to be keeping your eye on this incredible chat box that we have on our screens and on the questions that are emerging from the chat and from the webinar participants. But perhaps we can kickstart the conversation and then draw in questions that come in from the webinar participants. Anthony, I guess you probably used to being quite early on in the alphabet. Perhaps we kickstart the first question with your reflections. What are the major economic impacts that we should anticipate from the COVID-19 crisis? And what implications will this have for other policy priorities such as poverty reduction, equality, job creation?
Thanks very much, Najma, and thanks very much to GGKP for the invitation to join you for this very important and timely webinar. Just send greetings from Paris, where we're into our 7th week of lockdown. And at the OECD, we're pulling out all the stops to provide a very holistic and interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary perspective on the economic, social, and environmental implications of the COVID-19 crisis. It's really hard to overstate the impact of the crisis. The combination of demand and supply shocks and the urgency of the crisis is having huge implications across the economy for households, businesses, large and small, the tax system, global supply chains, the labour market. there are really very few corners of our societies that are immune. In this opening round, I'd just like to make four points in relation to your questions, Najma. First is in terms of the economic impacts. The situation is rapidly evolving. We haven't seen the end of it yet, of course. Many estimates are revised continuously, but the latest OECD estimates suggest that each month of containment could mean a loss of 2 percentage points in annual GDP growth, which is huge. There's no doubt about that. Secondly, the great lockdown and the ensuing economic crisis has really aggravated the pre-existing inequalities in our societies. It is hitting hardest those who are already in precarious socioeconomic situations. For example, at the beginning of the crisis, some 40% of households in the OECD were 3 months away from poverty. And the situation in the majority of developing countries is even more dire. The third point I'd make is that in addition to the human suffering and the loss of livelihoods for millions, the crisis has really made clear the vulnerability of our interconnected economies and societies. This global interconnectedness means that all the world's major cities, for example, are just a few days away from a new viral infection, no matter where in the world it may arise. And we're seeing firsthand the precariousness of the long and complex global supply chains that we've seen out there. So what governments are starting to do now, as a very important priority, is to focus on resilience. Resilience not just to pandemics, but to future shocks. This has really laid bare the importance of a cross-disciplinary, cross-policy area response to building resilience. And this is very positive for green growth if the right policies are employed. So we've got to ensure that the post-COVID recovery measures tackle socioeconomic inclusiveness as well as the low carbon transition and environmental protection together. If we don't do this, future generations are going to be not only repaying the massive debt that is now being built up, but they're also going to shoulder the costs of future environmental crises that are on a longer time span than the pandemic we're living through now, but are going to have very important implications for livelihoods, well-being, and green growth going forward. There's a very good quote, an article by Gernot Wagner, who's a climate scientist in New York, says that the COVID crisis is like climate change at warp speed. So very much of the very much the cascading effects of different system failures is laid bare in the COVID crisis, which we will see unfold over a longer time frame in relation to climate, for example, but also in relation to biodiversity. And my final point, Najma, in this opening salvo, if you like, is that we have to address the inequality and environmental challenges to get together. And a good example of this I'd point to is this nexus is environmental health. And last week we released a policy brief that highlighted the role of air pollution, water quality and access, waste management, and biodiversity protection in enhancing the resilience to pandemics and future shocks, as well as increasing well-being and improving productivity. So, for example, in relation to air pollution, it's clear that low-income households are more vulnerable to air pollution. Pollution affects the young and the old disproportionately, and reduced air quality increases the vulnerability of communities to pandemics such as COVID-19. So this nexus is key to moving forward. So in summary, I think the real challenge for us is to make sure that this recovery not only provides income and jobs, which are key, but also focuses on the broader, longer-term goals around integrating strong climate and biodiversity action and building resilience. So I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Anthony. Can we turn to Mohan, your reflections on the first question, the economic impacts that we could anticipate from the COVID-19 crisis and what implications this will have for other pressing policy priorities such as poverty reduction, equality, and job creation.
Greetings, Ayubowan from Sri Lanka. Thank you to the GGKP for inviting me. I will simply ride on Anthony's coattails because he gave us a very good introduction and try to make a few points as I sit in lockdown. I'm fortunate enough to be able to adjust. My food supply chains and other things are mainly secure, not completely, but I'm aware that there are billions of less fortunate people in the world who are going to feel this much more, the post-COVID world. So let me start with the focus on the poverty and inequality in the developing countries. Basically, what we are talking about is that we are facing, let me just look at my notes here. We're facing basically a perfect storm of all the things that could go wrong for the developing countries. Collapsing global trade, falling remittances, reversals of capital flows, currency depreciation. I'm focusing mainly on the economic aspects. And of course, there will be a very sharp increase in inequality in an already very unequal world. You know that 1% of the global rich control more wealth than the other 99%. There are many statistics. Just to give you an example of the capital flight, $100 billion flew out of the developing world just in the month of February. And to put that in counterpoint, I would point to you that in that same month or shortly after, because of the stimulus packages, particularly in the United States, the wealth of the billionaire class increased by 300 billion, not million, $billion. So their wealth increased. At the same time, millions of people lost their jobs, and even in the US, about 7 million people lost their jobs, but many more in the developing world. And we are looking at a kind of world where inequality and poverty are so endemic that we tend to forget that element while we are facing a so-called or a very real pandemic, not a so-called. And just to show what is happening here, why business as usual is not possible, we are not going to quietly deal with the pandemic because there are other crises around the corner. Already about 7 million people die of hunger. 200,000 have died from the pandemic, COVID, and that is, of course, a great tragedy. But the people who are dying from hunger will continue, and more will die because there was a recent estimate, I think, from FAO, which said 30 million more people are going to join the ranks of the hungry. So there is a piling on of these impacts, particularly in the developing world. And therefore, clearly the business as usual situation will not happen, but the kind of world that could emerge is going to be much worse for the poor and the destitute. And that is what we must try to prevent. And probably in the last part of this presentation, in the last question, I will try to deal with some of the potential remedies. But just to give you a hint, I have proposed something called balanced inclusive green growth. This has been around for 10 years or more. But basically, the green growth community knows that the current world is unsustainable because our economic methodologies and systems have been depleting the environment. And therefore, green growth, which I helped to build the original term in the 1990s, came along in order to protect the environment while not becoming a hindrance to further economic growth to raise the poor out of poverty. But clearly, green growth is not going to be enough unless we bring in the social element, and that is where the inclusive growth in green growth comes in. And balance requires that we balance all of these. Just to give you a very quick illustration, people talk about lives versus economy. Now, to the rich, economy means stock market. To the poor, economy means livelihoods. So is it lives versus stock market or lives versus livelihoods? If you look at the US again, recently, when about 7 million people filed for unemployment, the very next day, the stock market went up. So different people in this system are interpreting these things differently. And that is not a very coherent or sustainable world. And then you come to the earlier point I made, that poor people are already dying. More will die as collateral damage due to COVID. So it becomes then a lives versus lives debate, beyond lives versus economy. So we have to keep all these things in mind as we formulate solutions for the post-COVID world, particularly keeping in mind the SDG and the holistic nature of sustainable development to make sure that the solutions we come up with in the short term are effective, but also fit into a longer term vision of sustainability, which will not be what we have had in the past. Thank you.
Thank you for those opening reflections, Mohan. Kevin, your reflections on our opening question.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank colleagues, the panelists, for having touched on many of the issues that are necessary to be discussed, and also to the participants for listening in on this very important webinar. I want to then add to what my colleagues have said. First, I will look at the economic impacts from a developing country perspective, from African perspective. First, I see this in several dimensions. The first one is that we're having the impacts from the virus itself, which is the mortality rates, a lot of people dying, a lot of people getting sick. And that's an impact of having a pandemic, a medical pandemic. But then the impact of the way we are trying to address the pandemic and the way we did build our economies before the pandemic is even more for developing countries. And I know my colleague Mohan will agree with me. If I think about Africa, first, Africa is not seeing so many deaths from the pandemic yet because we're still at the beginning of the curve. But Africa is seeing so many deaths and has been seeing so many deaths from other pandemics that have gone unnoticed. Malaria, hunger, inequalities. A lot of women die for just trying to give birth. For access to infrastructure, like cooking food, which we take for granted in the developing world, kills more than 500,000 people, women and children, every year because of indoor air pollution. because of lack of access to clean energy. So what this pandemic is doing and has done for me is to actually to start reactivate the thinking about how the economy is unequal and how the inequities actually create vulnerabilities for the global economy in itself. Think about the response strategies that we have. One, social distancing and lockdowns. Lockdowns are not equal. You and I, we can sit down at home and we have access to electricity to store food, to store medicine, and so on. But this is not the case for over 50 to 60% of Africans and many people in the developing world who don't have access to energy. Mohan has talked about the income inequalities, so let me not go back to it. But when we are doing social distancing, a family that doesn't have a home has nowhere to be locked down in. And a family that has a home and has 12 people in one room, we're just creating congestion, which will kill more people because of the environment that are going to live in during that lockdown period. And that can lead to another pandemic, which is a social crisis, citizens rising against governments. Because again, lockdown is possible in the developed world because we then nationalize salaries, we nationalize wages, we nationalize the balance sheet of companies, we nationalize everything because there's this fiscal space to do that. In Africa and in many developing countries, it is not possible for governments to do that because they don't have that fiscal space to do that. So what I'm saying is both Mohan and Anthony have touched on the impacts of the pandemic on economics. But I want to go down to the impact of the pandemic on people, the citizens of countries, and how that is actually affecting and also on countries that have no fiscal space or very limited fiscal space or very limited monetary systems to be able to do quantitative easing and all these fiscal stimulus that we're hearing. Just to give you an example, the fiscal stimulus from one country alone is now up to more than about 2.7 trillion US dollars. But then the total GDP of sub-Saharan Africa is far less than that. So that raises more fundamental questions that I would like to think about with the interest of green growth, sustainability, and inclusive growth that we in this particular network have been talking about for quite some time. You keep in mind that before the lockdown, over 41% of people in sub-Saharan Africa were living on less than $2 a day. Less than $2 a day. So that's a pandemic that has been there because many people die, not reported, not counted, and so on. That's just statistics. And over 70% of Africans rely on what I call artisanal jobs, which is basically scavenging for livelihood. You go out to sell pap in order to get money to buy salt so that you can make gari at the end of the day. So when you have a lockdown in such situations, you're actually just subjecting the people to choose between not livelihoods and economy, but basically life and death. It's either they're choosing to die by the virus or they die by starvation. And these things have been going on unnoticed. People talk about it, we write about it, but then the world has not been paying so much attention. And then that leads me to one of the things I call the major benefits that the world can gain from this pandemic. Because unlike the other pandemics I've been talking about, the malaria pandemic, the polio, the cholera, all these other pandemics that has been there were localized. But this one is a supranational national pandemic, just like climate change, just like environmental change, just like all the things that in the sustainability world we think and talk about. And then because this now touches on the rich and the poor alike, the VIPs and the VVIPs and the less VIPs alike, the whole world is paying attention. So for me, I see an opportunity for us to actually rethink how our economy is wired. Why it is not only about growing GDP, because you can actually grow GDP, like Mohan has told us. You can see rise in incomes for the top 1%, while the whole world is actually suffering. That is not inclusive and that is not sustainable. And then because of the encroachments we have on social capital and then also on biophysical capital, in order to grow the environmental, to grow the financial capital, we have lack of stability in all the systems. So if you look at economic history, you find that economic growth has always been a swing. It keeps going up and down because we don't pay attention to the main things that sustain the economy, the people that the economy is supposed to serve, the social capital, the environment that's actually the source of materials for the economy to grow and to sustain itself. We normally don't pay attention until these kinds of things happen. So this raises for me some fundamental questions about the received wisdom about how we run our economies. What's the objective function for growth? The quality of growth matters. And if we don't pay attention to the quality of growth, but only the quantity of growth, we are going to have more pandemics that's more, or maybe even more than what we have now. And now I want us to think a little bit about the opportunity this gives us, because mainstream neoliberal economists have now come to realize that most of the rules that govern fiscal policy and monetary policy, fiscal discipline, is now not being considered so much, because otherwise we will not be nationalizing wages, even for the private sector. Otherwise, we will not be nationalizing the balance sheet of companies, both small, big, and big companies. So this is an opportunity for the Green Growth Network, for the people who are working in sustainable development, to actually speak to core economists in the economic language that they understand, that we understand, in the sense that there are catastrophes that are waiting to happen, like climate change. And just like countries are mobilizing to solve the problem of a pandemic that has killed about 200,000 people, we should mobilize even more to solve a pandemic that can actually decimate the whole planet. And that is climate change. We also need to mobilize to solve the pandemic that is actually killing many more people than the coronavirus will ever kill, and that is poverty. That is malaria. That is all these other diseases that has been plaguing the poor. And also, that is another point, lack of infrastructure in these economies to contain these problems when they come up. So if we had early warning systems and this thing was contained in the Wuhan province, we will not all be on lockdown today. So that for me is a call for global action that is no longer enough to have national policies that grow economies for nation states, but we actually need to have global policies that grows our commonwealth, what I call the global, and what we call the global commons, because this is the characteristics we see in climate change, we see in COVID-19, and we're going to see in other pandemics that come when they do come if we don't pay attention to them. So key question for me is, do we have sufficient tools in the current paradigm we have in terms of growth and economic policy making in order to be able to address these kinds of pandemics when they come again? And to do that, to think more on this, at the African Development Bank Group, we're actually convening a seminar, a policy seminar on strengthening resilience in African economies in a way to respond to this kind of pandemic. My colleagues have talked about a lot of the impacts. I don't want to talk about them again. The global value chain is something to think about very carefully, because if the value chains globally was not so interconnected, the transport of zoonotic diseases and will not be at the rapid pace as it is now. What is it telling us? Should we nationalize value chains, or should we globalize value chains carefully? It also tells us a lot about as I've talked about, the fiscal and monetary policy instruments that we use to govern our economies. And so many questions that we really need to think about. I see ourselves as though we were in the post-World War era, where John Maynard Keynes and co. thought about a new economy. For me, this is a chance for the world to think about a new economy, and that best new economy will be the one that actually thinks about social capital, natural capital, and economic capital equally, without giving too much preeminence to one against the other. Because in my view, that's the mistake we have all been making. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opening reflections. And I think, you know, looking at the questions coming in on the chat and from the participants, I think there's a very strong appreciation for the fact that the socio-economic dimensions, inequalities, poverty reduction have been highlighted. It would be very difficult to do justice to these incredible questions. So I'm going to try to take on two of the questions and share it probably among the panelists. Anthony, perhaps the first question to you, and I wanted to touch in my introduction on the employment situation. I think the ILO recently released quite a scary figure that the lockdown process has affected 4 out of 5 of the world's workforce, and already the world is facing real challenges, you know, to create jobs, to create decent work. And so one of the questions that I think I'd like to put to you from the chat is, what are the types of investments that could be done in a post-COVID-19 scenario to actually increase employment?
Oh, thanks a lot, Najma, and well done on trolling through the huge number of questions that have come through on the chat. It's great to see so much interest and so many great questions, and you've picked out a really good one, and I think this is key. And just to pick up on and it actually follows on a point that Kevin was making, that the underlying challenges of our economic way of life, of our environmental way of life, have not gone away because of COVID. They're still there. So poverty is still there, air pollution is still there, and employment challenges are still there. I think the COVID crisis has generated huge employment issues at a time when the nature of work was starting to change as well. So we have a lot of digitalization going on in economies, particularly in the OECD countries. The rise of the gig economy, the push towards greater automation, the rise of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and the implications that has for how employment, the nature of employment is going forward. And this just exacerbates and highlights these kind of systemic challenges that we face. So I think, in direct answer to your question, it's clear that we need to rethink how the skill sets of our employment, of our labour force are served. A greater focus on the STEM subjects, looking at a greater equality of access to education, focusing on upgrading skills to be fit for a new economy that focuses more around the provision of services and the importance of continuous learning. So I think there's a big investment task there for governments coming out of this crisis to look at the fundamental issues around the labour market, both the skill side and also the regulatory side. How is the labour market regulated? What are the issues around providing fair work, for people going forward for the labour force. I think there's some very fundamental issues there, and then that goes into the issues to the other point that was raised very well by Mohan and Kevin. That is around the quality of growth. I mean, it focuses not just on the quantity of growth, but how is that growth going to manifest itself in terms of well-being, in terms of sustainable livelihoods, both in developed and developing countries, and how is that quality of growth going to be distributed amongst the population between labour and capital, between rural and urban populations. There's some very fundamental issues there, and I think this is an opportunity to have a really good look at these systemic issues.
Thanks so much, Anthony, for your response. The second question I've picked from the chat is really around what is the expected impact of COVID-19 on nationally determined contributions, implementation and ambition? And just an indication, Mohan or Kevin, either of you that are interested to respond to that. I know we had this interesting event that we were planning this year, and one of our event themes was the super year for policy processes that would begin to integrate, the climate and biodiversity issues. And we know that it's turned into a difficult and challenging year, but yet these policy processes are underway. It's a year that countries are going to expand and update their nationally determined contributions to put forward enhanced ambition and action to meet climate targets. So Kevin, Mohan, anyone up for the question? What is the expected impact of COVID-19 on NDC implementation and ambition that we hope will be put forward in early 2021 by countries?
Let me, having been vice chair of the IPCC some years ago, that question is close to my heart, to my own interest. Let me not deal with it in a technical way, because nationally determined contribution is sort of a part of the jargon. One of the things that we did in the IPCC over a period of actually more than 20 years was to start with a very technical subject which dealt with emissions and other things, and actually show what it implied for humanity, first in terms of adaptation because of the impacts of climate change, and also in terms of mitigation, because we are actually creating climate change through our actions. So the main point here is that you cannot solve climate problems unless you deal with sustainability as a whole. And that is why climate change is only one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. We have to always keep it in mind. And the solution will come partly through focused thinking on nationally determined contributions and so on, but also to how those actions fit in with the overall sustainable development program of the country. And in a sense, the balanced inclusive green growth path tells us that if we curve the development path properly, we will not only deal with poverty and hunger and ill health and so on, but we can also deal with climate change along the way. And that is part of also the green growth message. And therefore, I would embed all the technical jargon elements like NDCs and also the national adaptation plans and other things within the bigger envelope of national sustainable development plans built around the framework of the SDGs, but also localized to each country, because each country has its own resource endowment in terms of natural capital. It has economic capital, which is different, and it has different kinds of social capital, which is what Kevin made. So we have both a unifying element of how we integrate these climate policies within a sustainable development framework from a global perspective, but we also have a local element, which is very country specific, which says each country has the right and the ability to determine its own way forward, where it solves not only the problem of climate change by itself, but as a part of overall sustainable development and all the other sustainable development goals. And there is a very valuable payoff. The payoff is this: climate change, particularly if you're starving and you're poor in a developing country, seems a little far away, right? I mean, it's 10, 20, 30 years away, whereas your next meal is today or tomorrow. So we have to also show, particularly the policymakers in developing countries, that while they are solving the problems of today, they can also deal with climate change as part of the package. It is not something, it's not a distraction which will take away from the fight against poverty or hunger or illness and so on. Let me stop at that.
Thank you, Mohan. Kevin, a question particularly around Africa, and I'd like to put this one to you. It says the pandemic has opened up the weaknesses of current economic development policies. How are youth and women issues included in the inclusivity and sustainability agenda in Africa?
Okay, thank you very much. I wanted to chime in a little bit on the question on climate change before I go to that one. Now, you see, that's the main problem that we've had in all the economic development history that I've looked at. We have different groups focusing on different aspects of a complete whole, and each different groups seem to be looking at trade-offs instead of complementarities. So if I go back to my concept of the natural capital, environmental or biophysical capital, and social capital, and then the economy, even us who are environmental people, sometimes we focus on the environment too much and not remember that we need the economy to be robust enough and resilient enough to be able to finance the environmental actions that we want to take. So in my PhD, I remember one sentence I put there many years ago, that keeping the poor in poverty is sustainable poverty, not sustainable development. And I don't think anybody wants sustainable poverty. So, and the challenge of climate change discourse and even the INDCs sometimes is if it is presented as an environmental objective, and we don't see how that feeds into the current development objectives of the countries that we're talking about. And this is something that Mohan has written quite a lot about. The impact on INDCs, we see COVID-19 is showing us different pathways for development. Everyone is now embracing e-government, e-working, e-everything. And that dramatically reduces commuting, transportation, and CO2 emission from the transport sector. It reduces the use of the brown technologies that we have always been talking about. So for me, I would rather see the opportunities in COVID-19 to actually chart new development platforms, help countries to build e-technologies, build capacities in science, in the STEM area, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, so that they can participate in the new world that will happen after COVID-19. And by so doing, we achieve the environmental goals as well. So that's one issue. So we need to actually not just think about INDCs as a standalone goal, but actually think about it in that whole. How do we bring all these things together in order to see structural changes we need to make in how we grow our economies, our fiscal policies, monetary policies, and sector policies, so that we'll be able to build better economies. I think also of the value chains. If the world were locating industries near resources, we reduce CO2 emissions from freights of raw materials quite highly. But what is happening now is a lot of raw materials in the developing world, we ship it to where the technology and the knowledge is, and then we ship back to the final products to the countries. And when I was in primary school, secondary school economics, I was taught about location of industries. You locate industries where the raw materials are. So if we did that, we would reduce the environmental rucksack of trade and so on. So we'll be able to produce locally and consume locally, and we'll reduce the CO2 emissions that the current paradigm of growth is creating. Then I go back to what you said about the impacts and the inclusivity of youths and women. For every nation, every continent, and for the whole world, youths and women are the engines of growth. In fact, the engines of sustainability, I will say so. Now, in many African countries, like Rwanda and different countries in Africa, that is actually at the forefront. At the African Development Bank Group, we have the president of the bank has come up with very innovative ways on how to support women, youth and women to build their businesses. Their power program, the affirmative finance action for youth, for women in Africa, the jobs for youth program. So Africa is focusing a lot on youth, but a lot more needs to be done. But where it becomes more important for me, even in this COVID-19 scenario, is that in my previous work as a CEO, executive director in the Science, Technology and Innovation Institute, we find that the youth of Africa, the women of Africa are very innovative people. So if we invest in them, we'll be able to come up with more M-Pesas, we'll be able to come up with more. If you go to Rwanda, if I use Rwanda again, where they are using drones to deliver drugs. So we'll be able to build health systems, agricultural systems, trade systems, and all these systems that we rely a lot more on e-technology. And by doing that, we will achieve the goals we have as a sustainability group by reducing CO2 emissions from the hard infrastructure that we normally use to move things around. So focusing on youth and women in the post-COVID-19 era is a central thing that needs to be done, because that's where you are going to get the innovation. That's where you are going to get the skills and actually the manpower to be able to, the person power, not manpower, to be able to move this thing, the new economy forward. So, but we need to think carefully so that we're not investing in continuing the current hegemony that we have in the current economy, but we're investing in a new economy that is more inclusive, focusing more on efficiency rather than growth. Efficiency in use of resources, efficiency in relationships, efficiency in medical systems, efficiency in early warning systems, and all these things. The work we did in the International Resource Panel shows that if we actually focus on efficiency, we will decouple growth from every environmental harm very significantly. But at the moment, the objective function is growing GDP, not about how efficiently it is done. Even if we fight a war and GDP grows, we are doing well. I don't think that is doing well. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you for your reflections on some of the questions from the chat. You've all sort of mentioned in different ways that we need to start looking at, more holistic solutions. Kevin, you also indicated that we need to find this balance between the environmental, the social, and economic, and that this is really an opportunity to put forward the holistic solutions, the types of investments that deliver, multiple outcomes. So the second question that I'd like to put to the panel is what actions governments would consider to achieve balanced and inclusive green growth pathways through their COVID-19 response. We've seen an incredible amount of activity at various levels, at city level, at country and at regional level, where there's been a strong commitment for implementing, green and just recovery plans. Your reflections on the actions that governments could undertake to actually put this into reality.
Najma,
Anthony.
before we go into that, may I expand on some of the points, particularly that Kevin made. I said in my opening remark that business as usual will not work in a post-COVID world. And basically what we are saying is that the neoliberal economic paradigm that has been the dominant one has in fact been very vulnerable to shocks, sort of black swan events, and they do not capture the downside effects, particularly if they are very severe. In the 2008 financial meltdown, we saw that. We are seeing this now with COVID, and this is why the time has come, I think, to think of a transformative agenda where we move forward with a new set of ideas. And I think Kevin already touched on this with green growth as a starting point, efficiency. I think Anthony mentioned in the sense of employment creation that we can use green growth, infrastructure and other things to create actually jobs and livelihoods for people that are sustainable, that do not destroy our natural resource base, at the same time develop a more inclusive set of societies around the world where people actually have livelihoods and earn decent incomes and can look after their families and not worry so much about propping up the stock market. And the reason why we need to move to this is basically because if you look at the actions, particularly of Western governments, and the word fiscal space was mentioned earlier, well, the fiscal space is being used not only, I would say, nationalize, but basically bail out the richest elements of society and institutions, so that the 80–90% of those bailout packages are propping up the wealthiest and the people who can most actually ride out the storm, whereas the poor who are not only unemployed but live in crowded conditions and are less able, even because of malnutrition or existing medical conditions, even face the threat of COVID, they are still completely exposed. So in a sense, what we are saying is that this paradigm must change, and because the nature of the crisis has illustrated the weaknesses of the existing system worldwide, not just in one country or the other, I think the time has come to engage in that debate. To start with, and I am probably going into territory which was not perhaps so popular some time ago, and that is we will move into a situation where you have a more multipolar world, where a single country or small group could control everything. Okay, and usually through manipulation of the currency, or sometimes through military force. So we need to work now, because of this COVID crisis, in a more regionalized system. Sure, some global supply chains will continue because it's necessary, but we will have more regional groupings, more multipolarity. We will have even more autarky within countries, not 100% self-sufficiency, but people want to make sure that their local food supply chains is assured, that some vital cereal or grain that is coming from 10,000 miles away is not suddenly cut off. So these changes will happen, and it is part of the transformative process. The other aspect I would stress, and Kevin mentioned efficiency particularly, that with efficiency must come the inclusiveness and sensitivity to income distribution, because inequality is one of the worst manifestations of unsustainability in my mind. And I will show you a little diagram, if it comes on the screen, just to illustrate the point. I mean, this is the world as we see it today. The rich, the champagne glass, are consuming a lot at the top. The poor are consuming very little, 1,000 times less, and all resting on a very small environmental base, which was, we have degraded the environment so much. So any little disaster can push us and tip us over. So it's unstable. We come now to green growth, which is a very good idea because we are broadening the environmental base. And this is more stable. But the balanced inclusive green growth, where we adjust also the income distribution in such a way as to reduce inequality and poverty, is actually the stable, sustainable scenario we want. And to move towards that, the present system, the present governing paradigm is certainly not sufficient. So we have to do that. And I would go back to risk management, which is one of my favorite areas, that we have these black swan events. We cannot expect smooth distributions with nicely behaving tails and work on expected values, that this is the probable outcome, when in fact some outlier, which could be very small probability, a catastrophic outlier, could come and disrupt the whole system. And that is exactly what the 2008 crisis was. But also, I come back to climate change, where we use the precautionary principle, because what we are saying is the insurance policy, that the probability that your house is going to burn down is minuscule, but you still buy an insurance policy because it's the only house you have. And in case it happens, it's such an unimaginable catastrophe that you have to have that insurance. So more and more, in an interconnected world, also in a world where we have a mismanaged environment so much, we have abused social norms, particularly with the growing inequality. And by the way, the poor are aware of inequalities because some of them, or many of them, do have access to television and other things. So they see it. And there is really a lot of outrage which can explode at any given time. So it's kind of being at the edge of a cliff. If we fall off the cliff, certainly change will come, but it will come in a very unacceptable way. If we can manage to tiptoe backwards, and that is the path which I'm talking about in terms of BIGG, I think we will be much smarter.
Thank you so much for your insights, Mohan. I think Anthony and Kevin, in formulating your response to the actions that governments could consider to achieve balanced, inclusive growth. I'd perhaps like to draw on what Mohan has put forward, which is this new narrative, this new development pathway, a new economy. There's been, quite a few of these kind of terms. And if we turn to the chat, we see questions around donut economics, around circularity. Has this narrative of balanced and inclusive growth really landed within governments, within institutions, and has it been mainstreamed, effectively, so that it can begin to influence the types of policy actions that we will see emerging? And then perhaps just an attendant reflection, if possible, just what the green growth community can actually do to begin to amplify at this very critical moment the kind of solutions and models and frameworks that present, this balanced approach. So Anthony, a mouthful from my side, but perhaps you can formulate a response. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Najma, and you've presented quite a challenge there. And I've been following the chat, and there are lots of very active participants there, and very interesting and good. I just pick up on one thing that Mohan raised before I move on to your exact question, Najma, and that's around the issue of trade. I think we need to recognise that trade is really essential to saving lives and saving livelihoods. I mean, in the midst of all this uncertainty, we do need to keep transparency around trade and trade-related policy actions. We need to keep the supply chains flowing, especially for things such as health supplies and food. We need to avoid making things worse through unnecessary export restrictions and other trade barriers. And even in the middle of all this crisis, we need to think beyond the immediate. We want to ensure that government support today is delivered in a way that serves the public interest and not vested interest, and avoids becoming tomorrow's market distortions. So I think on the trade front, I think there's some nuance needed in there in the way in which we're viewing trade. But to your question, Najma, some things that governments can do. Clearly, we're in the emergency response phase. I mean, the emergency rescue measures are underway. This is about supplying liquidity to businesses and households so they can stay afloat. They can get through the month after that, and the month after that. At this stage, from the green growth perspective, we need to make sure that we don't roll back the existing environmental standards as part of these rescue packages, that governments avoid going backwards. So that, for example, we've already seen some countries and local governments have suspended their bans on single-use plastics as they are perceived to be safer. We're seeing issues around the recycling industry with contaminated waste not being able to be properly handled inside the recycling systems. Some governments have been tempted to relax air quality regulations in the light of what is a very temporary improvement in air quality as a result of the reduction in economic activity. All these to push back on. So we need to avoid the rollback. We need to also systematically evaluate the possible unintended negative environmental impacts of these new short-term fiscal and tax provisions that we're seeing. And there's also a debate going on within governments around conditionality on sector-specific financial support measures, so that these may be conditional on environmental improvements where that might be feasible. Then when we turn to the longer term recovery phase. As I said before, the underlying issues have not gone away. So the things that were important for green growth before the COVID crisis are just important. A few additional angles. Systems resilience. The COVID crisis has taught us the importance of or this importance of cascading systemic failures, systemic impacts, and how important it is to have a preparedness and recovery and learning. This goes into a whole bunch of other areas of looking at how we integrate across sectors, across also the social system, the financial system. It's about the natural capital. We need to be looking at improving rather than destroying natural capital. And Kevin's points in his first intervention around the different types of capital and the importance of taking a capital approach were very much on the money there. And thirdly, looking at this issue of the environmental health of society. Transformative agendas are very important. They are needed for sure. The OECD has been at pains to promote the need for a transformative agenda to drive strong climate action, to drive towards a low carbon economy. But the here and now, what governments can do here and now to address well-being, to address the quality of people's lives now, is an important step towards that longer-term transformative agenda. So improving environmental health and seeing how this increases societal resilience in things like the transport sector. How we encourage cleaner vehicle fleets, how we avoid lock into the existing mobility paradigm. In the industrial sector, looking at the role of cleaner production and continued reductions in air pollution emissions. Water, waste, how we can put public money towards leveraging private investment to improve water infrastructure, improve access in the developing world, and then bring in a circular economy and increase resource efficiency. And through all this, we need to put people at the center. So reducing social inequalities has to be going hand in hand with things like the just transition, with things like support for reskilling and retraining. And I think going inclusive and green is clearly what governments will be needing to focus on in the future. I'll leave it there now.
Thanks, Anthony. I've lost you a bit there, but I hope for the rest of the webinar participants were able to follow most of Anthony's, or if not all, I hope, of Anthony's interventions. Kevin, I guess the first question that I put to Anthony was really whether this holistic narrative that balances between efficiency, justice, equity, resilience has actually really landed, sufficiently. And the second part of that is really what actions governments can begin to consider to achieve balanced, inclusive green growth through their COVID-19 responses. You need to unmute, Kevin.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, yeah, good. So thank you very much. Anthony has already, let me start from bottom up. What governments can do now, and then what governments need to do in the medium and long term. What governments can do now are varied tools that are available to governments, and I mean both national, regional, and global governance. Tax deferrals or even tax reductions is something that needs to be done in a way that is pro-poor. That's not bailing out the rich and increasing the income potentials of the rich that can cope with this, but bailing out the poor even more, because we need to build the confidence of people around governments and public governance. That is one thing that needs to be done, in my view. And that links to the safety nets, implementing social safety nets for economies where you don't have social safety nets, for health, for food systems, and all other aspects that COVID-19 has brought to the fore, including how do we ensure that the boy child and the girl child of the poor person, the poor families that does not have access to a laptop or a phone or anything to do e-schooling will not be left in ignorance for the rest of his life. because this social distancing may continue for a while. My children are continuing in schooling because they can have access to that, but I think of those who can't. So how do we try to make sure that we are not leaving them behind, we are bringing them in? We also need to restructure both public and private loans. How do we build a system that both financial for banks and so on, and even loans that governments owe, can be restructured in terms of deferred payments and even sometimes debt forgiveness? Because when you think about, if I go back to the issue about fiscal and monetary policy, if I follow the principles of economics squarely, neoliberal thinking, then I would be expecting that this volume of resources being poured into the economy somewhere else will lead to inflation somewhere else, if not in those countries, or even some forms of deflationary and stagflationary effects. But how do we make sure that the distributional effects of these things are cushioned for the poor? Is something that we need to do a little bit more. We need to try and reduce dependencies in terms of trying to create so much long value chains of everything. I don't understand why, for example, my continent, Africa, that has 60% of remaining arable land in the world, spends over 135 billion importing food. Can't that food be produced in those arable land in the world? So these are kinds of questions that I think we need to think about going forward. But governments also need to think about restructuring their budgeting system and their fiscal policy systems. Because even in the developed world, we are not actually, in my view, using these tools so efficiently. If you just write a check to everybody, people who are still working because they can do teleworking still receive that check. So that is not as if we're actually using that system effectively. Then I come to the medium to long-term things that needs to be done to build a more inclusive and robust economy. The global cooperation systems, I think, needs to be looked at very carefully, because there are questions of distributive justice and also moral justice that comes to question when problems that are supranational comes in, like climate change, and the effects of that are distributed down the pyramid. And countries who are up the pyramid come up with policies to protect their citizens. Meanwhile, we're the same citizens that have the global value chain. So food produced in rural India can be eaten can be sold in Walmart. So we are sources of in that global value chain in times of good globalization. But then when the challenges of globalization comes, we lock in, and then we are using national policies to try to address supranational national challenges. I think this is an area that the Green Growth Group, the Inclusive Growth Group, and Sustainability Group needs to try to look at a little bit more, because it applies to everything we care about. It applies to resource efficiency, it applies to climate change, it applies to poverty alleviation. One question I got was, is there any limit to the amount of money available in our economy if countries can come up with these trillions and trillions of dollars within weeks in order to solve the COVID-19 challenge that is killing about 200,000 people so far? Why have we not used those same tools to solve problems that Mohan has told us, reminded us, kills 9 million people? So these are the kinds of things that are raising questions that we need to look at a little bit more carefully. But in a more practical way, we need more proactive early warning systems. The way that governments communicate intelligence needs to be renewed and reactivated even more. Because I keep trying to stop myself from thinking, if the world were acting as one and went to Wuhan province to contain this virus, it will be least cost for everybody, for the environment, for business, for economy, and everything. So we need to try and share intelligence a little bit more and knowledge sharing a little bit more, sharing scientific knowledge a little bit more, so that we'll be able to contain global problems where they happen, because now we're in a globalized world. If this thing happened where we didn't have very interconnected global value chains, maybe the first person infected would have just died in the forest where he is doing hunter-gathering, or very few human fatalities may have occurred. But we are enjoying the benefits of the global value chain, so we need to solve the problems that are associated with it collectively as well. But key areas I see very quick wins, that is win-win for everyone, is e-trade, e-governance, e-schooling, e-everything. Before this COVID-19, the gig economy was all around us. We're seeing robotics, we're seeing the Bitcoin and everything trying to democratize how business is done. I think COVID-19 is showing us that it is possible. It is possible to run an economy, to actually do business without having to emit CO2 emissions and waste money and waste transport time and everything going from one place to the other that we call offices. Should we continue this teleworking more even after COVID-19? My answer should be yes, because that way we save everything we're thinking about. We save money, we save time, we increase productivity, and we also save the environment, because we are not using cars and getting stuck in traffic for 2 hours before you get to the office. And then for less developed countries, I would like to call that the world needs to focus on the challenges of filling the infrastructure gap. Because if the infrastructure gap in terms of access to science and technology, access to medical health infrastructure, access to energy, clean energy infrastructure, goods transport infrastructure, and all these things are there, we will be able to solve the global problems more collectively and more efficiently. And what we are seeing now is showing that the world has the capacity to do it. If half of the stimulus that has been raised to solve the COVID-19 problem were used to help in dealing with some of these challenges in the developing world, we will get a lot closer. We'll make Mohan a lot happier, because poverty will reduce more drastically. And we'll make the whole world happier because, and again, I go back to the work we did with International Resource Panel. We found that with increases in income and increases in technology, naturally, the economy is decoupled. Not by any other policy, but because you are increasing efficiency in technology. You are driving cars that are 2 years old instead of 20 years old. The CO2 emissions of a 2-year-old car and a 20-year-old car are definitely different for covering the same distance. And so is the cost of running that equipment. And the same thing for infrastructure, for energy, for everything. But because of lack of resources, because of poverty, the developing world that still needs to grow are using poorer efficiency in technologies. So can we finance efficiency in the developing world so that we can increase productivity, feed our global trade and value chains better, save the planet better? I think all these things can be done if we come together, realizing now, as COVID-19 has told us, that my health is good for your health. It doesn't matter where you sit in the world. It doesn't matter what office you are in. Because if I am the one who got COVID-19 and I have prepared apple, and apple comes to your desk and you eat apple, I'm transferring COVID-19 to you. And it doesn't matter where I live, because the global value chains, as we have said, is globalized. And we're not wanting to lose the benefits of that globalization. So what we call in Africa the Ubuntu culture, which is I am because you are. I exist because you exist. It's different from what I learned in philosophy, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I exist. So it's all about me. In Africa and in most developing world, it's about society, it's about connectivity, and so on and so forth. And I think this is something we need to export to the rest of the world. And I know it's the same thing for many developing countries, because that's how we survive. In monetary policy, reducing interest rate is good at some levels. Sometimes we can even have negative interest rate. I don't know how far those tools can go now, especially when you have all these quantitative easing that is happening. So what, if I would dare call the helicopter drop of money? Print more money and use it to solve your problems, because you can. But what about countries that don't have the productive base that can do that? So these are questions that are going around in my head, and I would like to ask us, the Green Growth community, to please join the African Development Bank Group in the seminar that is going to happen tomorrow from 2 p.m. in Abidjan time. I think Jessica has the links and can share it with us, because we want to start looking at these questions in more depth. How do we actually use this as an opportunity to drive inclusive and green growth? The African Development Bank has been the forerunner of inclusive and green growth through the 10-year strategy. These are the only two goals of the bank, to drive inclusive and green growth in Africa. And then the High Fives agenda, which President Akinwumi Adesina brought to the bank, also focuses on doing that in a sector-based way to feed Africa in an inclusive and better green way, to provide energy, power, energy, climate change, and green growth. This is the only MDB that actually mixes all those four things in one pot: power, energy, climate change, and green growth, because we need all of them, and they need to feed into each other in order to be able to light up and power our economies. To industrialize Africa in a green way, integrate Africa in a green way, and improve the quality of lives of Africans in a green and inclusive way. Join us tomorrow so that we can benefit from your wisdom on how to make this happen in Africa, because the pole of growth for the future is the developing world. So let's try and help the developing countries to tow a different path of growth that will not leave us to these vulnerabilities that we're seeing in the current kind of growth that we have. For the developing world, three things I think needs to be addressed very quickly. Building robustness of their fiscal space, the monetary systems that we have, e-banking needs to be highlighted a little bit more, and then dealing with our external debt vulnerability. I think the G20 needs to think about debt forgiveness, not just debt deferrals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin. You've left us with a lot of questions and a lot of ideas I think we can take forward. Perhaps in the last few minutes that we have remaining, I can just hand over to Mohan and Anthony for your final thoughts, really, as we go forward. We hope into a phase of recovery in most countries. We've heard a lot of principles being put forward: resilience, equity, justice. I would like to add to that, sufficiency in addition to efficiency. What we really need, I think we've seen the incredibly important role that resilient local economic systems and communities play in these type of crises. Your final thoughts on public policies and how they can support this transition to pathways that are more balanced, more inclusive, and more environmentally sustainable. Mohan, I guess in the 2 minutes we have remaining, first minute goes to you.
Well, let me first say that I started with big thoughts on the global level. Let me go to a very personal level, because what this crisis tells us is that individual actions matter. And in a sense, it's like climbing a mountain. The peak is covered with clouds and it's far away, but if we take one step at a time, we will get there if we work together. And individual actions do matter. And that's what this COVID crisis tells us. And that's why inclusivity and thinking about other people and having what we call emotional intelligence, as opposed to the conventional mental intelligence, is also important. So let us work on that theme and then bring about a global movement which will transform the global system, starting with ourselves and working with everybody else together.
Thank you so much, Mohan. They were excellent points. Anthony, your final thoughts as we close our webinar today.
Heavens above, the last word, Najma. Thanks very much. And I would just finish up with a plea for greater international cooperation. I think a multilateral approach is the only way to go. But unfortunately, we're pushing against some headwinds of nationalism, countries starting to pull up the drawbridge. And I think this is not going to serve national interests well, and it's not going to serve the global interests well. So I think organizations like the OECD, World Bank, IMF, and the multilateral development banks have a huge role to play in trying to drive a coordinated and cooperative outcome in not just in the response and recovery from the pandemic like COVID, but the more longer-term green growth fundamental challenges that still remain when and have been somewhat exacerbated as a result of the pandemic. So just like to thank you for the very stimulating discussion, and look forward to somehow finding my way through all the myriad questions that were in the chat room, which was fantastic.
Thank you. I mean, we absolutely could not do justice to the questions that came out. I think some of them we addressed in our responses, but from my side to all three of you, thank you for joining me in this, I think, a very critical conversation that we're having. I think this opportunity to learn from one another and to listen to, perspectives. Mohan, thank you so much for bringing it home, making it, about all of us at the end, be part of families and communities and societies. As much as we care for countries and our global system, and I think this has surely had us all connect back into those spaces. So from my side, thank you to all the participants for joining us for this webinar. We hope that the ideas, the thoughts, the solutions that the panelists have put forward have stimulated your thinking and the kind of solutions that you want to propose in your country. Have a good day further wherever you are. Stay healthy and safe. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.